Hello again, everyone. I'm Lucas, as you now know, and welcome back. First of all, I want to say thank you all for the support on the previous video and for the channel in general. I was really stoked to see all your comments and suggestions and that you liked the video and the channel and that you want to hear me discuss more things. And I'm really excited to make more videos and get into more of these topics with you, especially the ones that you've been suggesting. I saw free will pop up a couple times, which I briefly mentioned in the last video, and that's a really interesting topic, so I'll definitely do a video on that soon. So I want to start by doing a few videos that serve as kind of introductions to the topics of psychedelics, philosophy, and meditation that lay out some fundamental concepts and ideas that'll be in the background of a lot of future topics that I discuss. So I'm going to start here with psychedelics, and I'll do a video or two on free will and the nature of self as well, which will serve as an introduction to meditation, and I'll do a couple philosophy related ones as well. Also, feel free to suggest topics and ask questions too. I want this to be as much of a dialogue as possible, and if there's something you want me to discuss or hear my thoughts on, just let me know. So in this video, because of what this channel will largely be about, I want to introduce and give an overview of the topic of psychedelics in a very fundamental way. For those that might only have a vague or general understanding of psychedelics and want to know more, or for those who have no idea at all, and that's fine. There will be some of you though who are already very familiar with all of this, but I don't want to alienate anyone listening and assume that everyone knows what I'm talking about, and I always want to try to explain the major concepts and ideas behind the topics that I discuss, so we can all follow as best as possible. And also, I just think it's really helpful and beneficial to revisit the most basic and fundamental underpinnings of topics and ideas from time to time. Okay, what are psychedelics? So I'm going to break this into a few different parts. The pharmacology and neurophysiology, which are the drugs themselves and their effects. The etymology and our conceptual understanding of psychedelics, which is the origin and meaning of the word. And then a brief history of where psychedelic study in modern science and philosophy started. And finally, how our conceptual and scientific understanding of psychedelics has changed over time to get to where we are now and what we now know and understand about psychedelics. This might sound a bit complicated, but I'll break it all down. Let's start with which compounds we're talking about. So the word psychedelic doesn't necessarily have to mean drugs, it just refers to a specific kind of experience that has certain characteristics, which I'll explain shortly, but in terms of psychedelic drugs, this term generally refers to what are called classic psychedelics, which is what a majority of my discussion on psychedelics will refer to. The classic psychedelics are NN-DMT, usually just referred to as DMT, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT, which is found in the venom of the Sonoran desert toad, psilocybin and psilocin, which are the active ingredients in psilocybe mushrooms or magic mushrooms as they're most commonly known, LSD, which was synthesized from a fungus called ergot growing on rye, and mescaline, which is the active ingredient in peyote and other cactuses such as San Pedro. So DMT, LSD, and psilocybin are what are known as tryptamines, which is a particular kind of chemical structure that's found in both nature and our brain. As an example, serotonin and melatonin are two types of tryptamines that occur in our brain. Mescaline is a bit different. It's what's called a phenethylamine, which is more structurally similar to MDMA and 2CB, which are other psychoactive and sometimes called psychedelic drugs. But what groups all of these compounds together as classic psychedelics is that their primary mode of activation is through binding to the serotonin 2A receptor. So essentially what that means is that the drug mimics serotonin, binds to the receptor, and then we have the effect of the drug until it wears off. And this is also why, to an extent, these classic psychedelics are somewhat similar in their effects, because they all primarily function through the same receptor. But I'm hesitant to give too much weight to that because of the unique way each drug affects the brain, and anyone with experience will know that they all have very distinct characteristic effects. We can think of them more as siblings, or kind of like Tarantino movies. They're all distinctively and unmistakably Tarantino movies, and they're all great in their own way, but they're not all the same, and they each offer something different. So psychedelics are kind of like that too. You can tell that they're psychedelics, that much is clear, but they're all substantially different in their own way. They all have their own distinct character, and some people prefer some over others. So what are the neurophysiological effects that they have? Well, as succinctly as possible, classic psychedelics cause visual distortion and hallucination and reduce areas in the brain responsible for self-referential thought and executive function, most prominently in what's called the default mode network, which can be thought of as the part of the brain that's responsible for the correct ordering and functioning of different parts of the brain and mental constructs and concepts, and is active when we're thinking about ourselves and others and time. When this is quiet, we have more communication between different parts of the brain and less self-referential thought. so our brain is in more of a free association state. Now, just as a side note, what I find very interesting and important is that the neurophysiological effects of psychedelics are quite similar to meditation. And this is one of the reasons why I think they should be discussed together, which is what I'm doing on this channel. And I'll do a video on that quite soon. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher. So I'm not going to always be able to give the perfect scientific explanation, but I just want to give you a general idea and understanding based on the research. If you want to know more about the science and the effects of psychedelics on the brain, I'll link some research articles and papers that I use to inform myself, and you can check those out and correct me if I've got anything wrong. Okay, so now the etymology, which is the origin and meaning of words, which, as you'll see, is very important when it comes to understanding psychedelics. So, psychedelic comes from the fusion of two ancient Greek words, psyche, which means mind, and delos, which means manifest. So, essentially, psychedelic means mind manifesting, which points to the most primary subjective effect of psychedelic drugs. They manifest your mind in your direct experience, including both yourself and the parts of your mind that aren't your recognizable self, such as your unconscious and the collective unconscious, which is an idea of the psychologist Carl Jung that refers to essentially collectively held data in our DNA from our societies and culture and history over time. So our understanding of psychedelic drugs is that they manifest the contents of our mind in a generally unpredictable way. It's important to point out here, though, that this is the word we have chosen to use that best describes the effects of these drugs. The most characteristic thing about the psychedelic experience is its so-called ineffable nature, which means that it's seemingly impossible to accurately put into words. Although what's useful about the word psychedelic is that it's so broad and even potentially vague that it allows for this and casts a pretty wide conceptual starting point for investigating the mind-manifesting effects of psychedelics, however someone wants to understand mind. And anyone who has had a psychedelic experience knows what I mean here about their ineffable nature. Our tools of language are just simply unfit to describe the experience. We don't have the words or the conceptual capacity, at least at this point, to accurately describe it. At best, we can offer words that kind of get to the point, and someone who has had the same experience will know what we mean, but that's only because they know the experience we're referring to, not really because the words directly explain it. So we can see that this is true because people who have never had a psychedelic experience can conceptually understand these descriptions, yet when they have the experience, they recognize that the words do not at all do justice to the experience itself. Okay, so this brings up an important distinction that I'll discuss a lot on this channel, because it's so important to the topics of psychedelics and meditation. And this is a distinction that Sam Harris uses a lot on his meditation app, Waking Up, which I highly recommend, by the way. This is the distinction between concepts and experiences, between conceptual understanding and experiential understanding. So, conceptual understanding refers to a linguistic and intellectual understanding of something, an understanding of something through our thought, in our mind, which is not necessarily tied to an experience or an experiential understanding of this concept or what the concept refers to. For example, in this case, one can conceptually understand the effects of psychedelics, or the concept of selflessness or ego dissolution, where one loses their sense of self, without having ever experienced it, without having an experiential understanding of it. An experiential understanding then refers to understanding something by direct experience, having felt it and lived it. But experiences are just that, experiences. And we can have both conceptual understandings and experiential understandings. So this is all to say that using the word psychedelic is our best way of conceptually framing what psychedelics do, manifest the mind. But this wasn't always the term that was used. Before scientists and researchers really figured out what they had their hands on, it was understood differently. Now, before I get into this, I want to explain when these compounds were first synthesized and isolated, which means when the drug was first discovered or reproduced and created in the lab. And I want to mention a few key figures that contributed to the widespread use and rise of psychedelics in the West. This, and my discussion of the different scientific models used to understand psychedelics, should serve as a brief introduction to the history of psychedelic science and philosophy. So, mescaline was first isolated in 1987 and synthesized in 1919 from peyote, which is a cactus that's been used as a psychedelic for at least 6,000 years by Native Americans. In 1954, Aldous Huxley, who was an English author most famous for his dystopian novel Brave New World, published a book called The Doors of Perception, which is an account of a mescaline trip he had. And it's probably the most well-read trip report ever, and is pretty influential in terms of psychedelic literature, and people having access to a pretty accurate description of what the experience feels like. Though most importantly, I think it's a very good place to start for our conceptual understanding of psychedelics and the philosophy of psychedelics. LSD was first synthesized in 1938 from ergot by Albert Hofmann, who is a pretty significant figure in psychedelic history, and this is where we get Bicycle Day from, which is April 19, 1943, when Hoffman had the first ever LSD trip and rode his bike home from his lab in Switzerland, which is what that picture there behind me is about. Also, it's pretty cool that it's April 19, which is one day before 420, if you see what I'm saying. That can make for a pretty festive couple of days. So, ergot is suspected to have been used by the ancient Greeks as part of a brew or potion known as the kykeon, which was sacramentally used in the Eleusinian Mysteries. Again, referring to the name of this channel. I promise I'll eventually get to doing a video on that. And so this was a pretty important and sacred ritual in the ancient Greek and Roman world, who everyone was able to attend, including some pretty significant historical figures like Plato and Marcus Aurelius. So Hoffman, along with Gordon Wasson, who I'll mention in a moment, and Carl Ruck published a book regarding this in 1978 called The Road to Eleusis. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail here because, like I said, I'll do a separate video on this, but I want to do that once I've finished reading Brian Murarescu's The Immortality Key, which was influenced by The Road to Eleusis. But I think it's important to at least point out here the suspected use of an LSD-related alkaloid in ancient Greece, which was in many ways the founding culture of Western civilization. And then we have psilocybin, which was first synthesized in 1958, also by Albert Hoffman, after Gordon Wasson, a former banker who became an ethnomycologist, which is someone who studies the historical use of mushrooms, brought back a sample of psilocybin mushrooms from Mexico, after being the first Westerner to undergo a shamanic experience in Mexico from the famous curandera, which is like a shaman, Maria Sabina. And mushrooms are thought to have been used for at least 9,000 years, based on the evidence, but it would not be surprising if they'd been used for a lot longer. In 1978, one of, if not the most important figures in Western psychedelic history, Terence McKenna, and his brother Dennis published a book called Psilocybin, Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide, after their life-changing experiences with mushrooms in the Amazon. And this book detailed how to grow psilocybin mushrooms very easily in your own home. So you can see why this book was so popular and how that led to mushrooms becoming even more accessible and widespread. And you can still buy this book if you want for your own research purposes. So Terence is most known for his talks and his incredible way of describing and discussing the ideas he had about psychedelics and language and consciousness. And I'd definitely say he's the most significant and really the first true philosopher of psychedelics, unless you count Huxley as well. And finally, DMT. So DMT was first synthesized in 1931, but its effects weren't known until 1956. DMT is interesting because it's a chemical that's found all over nature and even in the human body, but in its natural plant form, it can only effectively be consumed with an MAO inhibitor, so the DMT can be metabolized by the body, which is what ayahuasca is, the brew that's been used in shamanic rituals in the Amazon for at least 1,000 years. Now, I haven't said much about 5-MeO DMT here because I struggled to find some accurate sources on it, and its history is a bit more muddled and complicated than the other psychedelics anyway. I'd suggest just watching Hamilton Morris's show, Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, if you haven't heard of it. That's an excellent breakdown of all sorts of psychedelic and other drugs. And yeah, really informative when it comes to 5-MeO DMT especially. So as we can see, the classic psychedelics have only very recently been discovered and begun to be studied and understood in Western science, and have been used with great cultural significance around the world for a very long time. Alright, so back to the different scientific models for understanding psychedelics, and what we can learn from all this. So when researchers were first experimenting with LSD around 1950, it was understood as a psychotomimetic, which essentially means that it mimicked the symptoms of psychosis. And as you can imagine, before these researchers had any idea about psychedelics and their sensitivities and how to use them safely and optimize your set and setting for a positive experience, the typical effects of ego dissolution, hallucination, and sometimes paranoia, depending on where you are, without a context or framework for understanding, would have looked and felt similar to what psychosis would have seemed to be like. After more research was conducted throughout the 50s with LSD, people began to report feelings of transcendence, tranquility, and profound experiences of beauty and truth, and researchers began to have an appreciation for the impact of the physical environment on people's experiences, otherwise known as the setting, with a clinical, white-walled lab coat setting proving to not be very helpful at all. That's really kind of a recipe for disaster and the last thing that you would want when you're tripping. Probably feels a lot more like you've been abducted by aliens than you're freely exploring your mind and having some kind of potentially spiritual experience. So then from here, there was the psycholytic model, which was used towards the end of the 50s, which meant mind loosening. And this was a lot more accurate than the previous model and was used pretty successfully with low doses in psychotherapy. But Around the same time, a psychiatrist called Humphrey Osmond, who administered Huxley's first mescaline experience that he wrote about in The Doors of Perception, came up with the name psychedelic in a letter he wrote to Huxley. And he used this model of mind manifesting in psychedelic therapy, where the mystical experiences that people reliably had under the right conditions with high doses were very beneficial to psychological healing and being able to see things from new perspectives. And this led to the more famous studies done at Harvard in the 60s by another two of the most influential figures in Western psychedelic history, Doctors Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, or Ram Dass, as he later became known. Now, there's a whole lot more to it, but this is briefly how the understanding of these drugs as mind manifesting as psychedelic drugs began. And I just really wanted to give an overview of that, especially in relation to our conceptual understanding. There's a few things to take away from this. That psychedelic drugs are extremely susceptible to one's mindset going in and the physical setting we're in. That the way we understand these drugs conceptually impacts how we experience them. And that under the right settings, they reliably induce mystical experiences, which I'll get into in another video, and feelings of unity, love, transcendence, peace, and euphoria, and can help people see themselves in their life in a completely different way, and as a result, live better lives and heal from various mental illnesses, which countless studies have shown. And finally, which I think is the most salient point in relation to my discussion here, is that understanding these drugs as psychedelic most accurately captures the essence of what these drugs do. And this is why the psychedelic model is most widely accepted. And I also think this most closely mirrors the ancient and indigenous use of psychedelics and their understanding of what they do. So this all goes to show the importance of the concepts and language we use to discuss psychedelics, and how we frame and understand these experiences within our existing conceptual frameworks and in new frameworks that we develop to better understand them. And one thing I really want to point out is that while we've had a lot of progress in our scientific understanding of psychedelics, I think there's been less of a focus on our conceptual and philosophical understanding, which is important in order to make sense of these experiences with our language and in our thinking, so that we can figure out how to reintegrate their use into our lives and in modern culture and society, which is inevitably the way things are going anyway. And this is something you'll hear me talk about a lot, and is the area of psychedelic study and philosophy for that matter that I most want to offer what I can to. And on that note, I think this is Terence McKenna's greatest contribution to our understanding of psychedelics, the importance of language. Our language and concepts are currently not able to accurately understand or represent the psychedelic experience, but as philosophers or researchers or explorers, if we wish to contribute to furthering our understanding of psychedelics and the psychedelic experience, it's our job to improve our language and concepts, and as a result, our capacity for thought to better grasp these things and what they might mean and how we might use them. Okay, so I hope this video has been informative and has covered the most fundamental and important aspects of what we currently know about psychedelics and the history of their study. Now, there's a whole lot more to it and a whole heap that I've left out, but this video is already pretty long as it is, and I think this is a pretty good starting point anyway, and it'll allow us to get into a lot more topics in future videos. Also, I hope this wasn't too long or there was just too much information in it, but if it was, please just tell me and I'll do shorter videos. And I do intend on doing a video in the future where I focus on the effects of psychedelics, because even though I mentioned it here, there's a whole lot more to be said. Thank you again for watching and listening. I appreciate it very much, and as always, feel free to ask or suggest anything. Thank you.